The thunder cracked across the vast Texas sky as Wilhelmina Zanetti clutched her swollen belly, her knuckles white against the wooden table edge. 6 months in Presidio, Texas had hardened her to many things: the relentless heat, the dusty winds that swept across the border from Mexico, and the loneliness of frontier life, but nothing had prepared her for this. Her baby wasn't supposed to come for another month, and Edward, her husband of 2 years, was 3 days into a week-long cattle drive to Fort Davis. "Not now," she whispered to her unborn child, wincing as another contraction gripped her. "Please, not yet." Rain pounded against the roof of her modest homestead, 3 miles outside of town, too far to walk in her condition, especially in this storm. The midwife, Mrs. Halloran, lived on the other side of Presidio, and with the usually dry creek now raging between them, Wilhelmina knew no help would come. She managed to stand, her long cotton nightdress clinging to her legs with sweat despite the cool night air seeping through the cabin windows. Lightning illuminated the room in harsh white flashes as she made her way to the bed, each step an agony of effort. 24 years old and alone, she had never felt so terrified. The knock at her door came so suddenly she nearly screamed. Through the pain, she called out, "Who's there?" Her voice trembled despite her efforts to sound strong. "Owen McClintock, madam. Passing through to my brother's ranch when the storm hit. Saw your light. Might I shelter in your barn until it passes?" Wilhelmina hesitated only a moment before another contraction doubled her over. "Come in," she gasped, knowing that whoever this stranger was, he represented her only hope. The door swung open with a gust of rain-soaked wind, and a tall figure stepped inside, water streaming from his wide-brimmed hat and long duster. He swept off his hat, revealing dark hair and a face weathered by sun, but not by years. He couldn't be much past 30. His eyes, however, held the experienced gaze of a man who had seen much of life. "Madam, are you?" He stopped abruptly, taking in her condition with a glance. "You're with child. The baby's coming," Wilhelmina managed through clenched teeth. "My husband's away. The midwife can't get here." Owen McClintock stood frozen for only a second before his expression settled into determined calm. He hung his dripping coat and hat by the door and rolled up his sleeves. "I've helped birth calves and foals," he said, moving toward her with careful steps. "Even helped once with my sister-in-law's baby when there was no one else." "I don't have much choice in the matter, do I?" Wilhelmina said, attempting a smile that dissolved into a grimace as another pain racked her body. "No, madam, I reckon you don't," Owen replied, his voice gentle despite its depth. "And neither do I. Let's get you comfortable. This might be a long night." The rain continued its assault on the little cabin as Owen moved with surprising efficiency, stoking the fire in the stove, heating water, and gathering clean linens from the chest Wilhelmina directed him to. He spoke little, but his presence filled the room with a steadiness she desperately needed. "Edward," she gasped as he helped her back to the bed. "My husband, he doesn't know. He'll know soon enough, Mrs. Zanetti, Wilhelmina Zanetti, Mrs. Zanetti." Owen nodded, setting a basin of warm water beside the bed. "I'm afraid we haven't the luxury of waiting for Mr. Zanetti's return. This little one seems determined to meet the world tonight." Hours passed, marked by the gradual easing of the storm outside and the increasing intensity of Wilhelmina's labor within. Owen proved himself a capable attendant, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he offered her water, wiped her brow, and supported her through each wave of pain. When she cried out, fearing she could bear no more, his voice came low and steady near her ear. "You are brave, Mrs. Zanetti. Braver than any soldier I've ever known." Something in the sincerity of his words gave her strength, and when the time came, Wilhelmina pushed with renewed determination. With a final, tremendous effort, her child entered the world in the early hours before dawn, announced by a lusty, indignant cry. "A boy," Owen declared, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped the infant in clean linen. "A strong, healthy boy." Exhausted but overcome with joy, Wilhelmina reached for her son. Owen placed the small bundle in her arms with a care that brought tears to her eyes. In that moment, Looking at her child and then at the stranger who had become her unexpected savior, something shifted in Wilhelmina's world, something she was too tired to examine but could not deny feeling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Owen McClintock stood back, his tall frame silhouetted against the now gentle firelight. "I'm glad I was passing by," he said simply. "I'll stay until morning, make sure you're both well, then fetch the doctor from town if the creek's gone down. You should rest now." As dawn broke over the Texas hills, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Wilhelmina drifted into exhausted sleep with her newborn son beside her. She was vaguely aware of Owen moving quietly around the cabin, tending the fire, preparing a simple breakfast, caring for her small homestead as though it were his own. She didn't know then how deeply this night would change her life, or that the man who had delivered her son would, in time, deliver her heart from grief as well. All she knew in those first peaceful moments of motherhood was gratitude, and the strange, unsettling feeling that fate had sent Owen McClintock to her door for reasons beyond the storm. Morning brought clarity to Presidio as the storm clouds retreated toward the distant mountains. Owen had tended to Wilhelmina's livestock after ensuring both mother and child were resting comfortably. He'd found oats for her mare, corn for the chickens, and even milked the cow that had been lowing miserably in the barn. By the time Wilhelmina awoke, he had a pot of coffee brewing and cornbread warming on the stove. "You've been busy," she observed, her voice still weak but her eyes brighter than they had been during the night's ordeal. The baby slept peacefully beside her, his tiny face serene in the morning light. "Seemed the least I could do," Owen replied, pouring her a cup of coffee and bringing it to the bedside. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Zanetti?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted with a small laugh, "but alive thanks to you." She accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Please call me Wilhelmina. I think we're well past formalities after last night." Owen smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face from handsome to breathtaking. "Wilhelmina, then," he agreed. "And the little one, have you decided what to call him?" She gazed down at her son, studying his features. "Edward and I had chosen Robert if it was a boy after his father, but now—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "Robert's a fine name," Owen offered, moving back to the stove to check on the cornbread. "Perhaps as a middle name," Wilhelmina said thoughtfully. "I think after last night he should have a name that speaks to how he came into this world." She looked up at Owen, her eyes meeting his. "Thomas, it means twin, because it took two of us to bring him safely here." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the unusual bond forged in the night's crucible. Owen broke the gaze first, nodding as he turned back to his cooking. "Thomas Robert Zanetti sounds like a man who'll make his mark on the world." After they had eaten, Owen reluctantly announced his intention to ride into town. "The creek should be passable now. I'll fetch the doctor to check on you both and see about sending word to your husband if possible." Wilhelmina felt an unexpected pang at the thought of his leaving, even temporarily. "Of course, but Owen," she added as he reached for his hat, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." He settled the hat on his head, the brim shadowing his eyes. "No thanks needed, Wilhelmina. Any decent man would have done the same. Perhaps," she said softly, "but I'm not certain any man would have done it with such care." His expression softened momentarily before he squared his shoulders. "I'll return as soon as I can. Keep the door locked while I'm gone." The doctor, a kindly older man named Pearson, arrived with Owen by midday. He examined both Wilhelmina and Thomas with practiced efficiency, pronouncing them both remarkably well considering the circumstances. "You did a fine job, McClintock," Dr. Pearson said approvingly. "Most men would have panicked faced with bringing a child into the world." Owen shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I did what needed doing, nothing more. And what of my husband?" Wilhelmina asked, cradling Thomas against her shoulder. "Were you able to send word?" "The telegraph line to Fort Davis is down from the storm," Owen explained, leaning against the doorframe. But I spoke with Harlan Jenkins, who's riding out that way tomorrow with supplies. He'll deliver a message to the cattle drive. Then Edward won't know until tomorrow at the earliest, Wilhelmina said, calculating quickly. And it would be at least 2 days after that before he could return. I can stay until then, Owen offered, then hastily added, out in the barn, of course, just to make sure you have what you need. Dr. Pearson raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he packed his bag. Mrs. Zanetti should rest as much as possible. No chores, limited movement for at least 3 days. The baby should nurse frequently. He handed Owen a small packet of herbs. Brew this for her 3 times daily. It will help with her recovery and her milk. After the doctor departed, a new awkwardness settled between them. The intimacy of the birth had created a connection that neither knew quite how to navigate in the light of day. Owen busied himself with outdoor chores while Wilhelmina tended to Thomas's needs, but each was acutely aware of the other's presence. That evening, as Owen brought in fresh water and wood for the night, Wilhelmina finally asked the question that had been on her mind. You said you were passing through to your brother's ranch. Where exactly were you headed? Owen set down the wood near the stove, about 20 miles north of here. Jeremiah McClintock's place, the Double M. Wilhelmina's eyes widened slightly. I've heard of it. Your brother has one of the largest spreads in the county. That he does, Owen confirmed, a hint of something pride, resentment coloring his tone. And you, do you work with him? Owen settled into the chair across from her, stretching his long legs toward the fire. Not exactly, I've been wandering, I suppose you could say. Worked as a trail guide, a ranch hand, even tried my hand at prospecting up in Colorado for a spell. He offered a self-deprecating smile. Not much good at staying in one place. What brings you back to Texas then? His expression grew more serious. My brother's letter said our mother's health is failing. I've been away too long. The simple admission revealed more about Owen McClintock than perhaps he intended. Wilhelmina sensed a man divided, pulled by family obligation, yet driven by some restless seeking she couldn't name. I'm sorry about your mother, she said softly. Family is precious. Owen's gaze moved to Thomas, sleeping peacefully in the makeshift cradle he'd fashioned that afternoon from a wooden box and soft blankets. Yes, he agreed, his voice low, more precious than I remembered, perhaps. The next 2 days established a rhythm between them. Owen slept in the barn as promised, but spent his days ensuring Wilhelmina wanted for nothing. He cooked simple but nourishing meals, tended the animals, and even managed to repair the loose shutter that had been banging against the cabin wall for months. Wilhelmina found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way his strong hands moved with surprising gentleness, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at Thomas, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. For his part, Owen seemed increasingly reluctant to continue his journey, finding new chores that needed doing before he could leave. When Thomas fussed during the night, he appeared almost instantly at Wilhelmina's door, offering to walk the baby while she rested. They talked for hours about books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd harbored. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of an Italian immigrant father and a mother from Boston society who'd scandalized her family by marrying beneath her station. He shared tales of his wanderings that made the wider world seem both terrifying and tantalizingly close. What neither of them spoke of was Edward, or what would happen when he returned. The shadow of his imminent arrival hung between them, acknowledged but unaddressed. On the morning of the 3rd day, as they sat drinking coffee while Thomas nursed, Wilhelmina finally broke that silence. He's a good man, my husband, she said abruptly. Hard-working, determined to make something of this land. Owen nodded, his expression carefully neutral. I'm sure he is. We married for practical reasons as much as affection, she continued, needing suddenly for Owen to understand. His first wife died of fever 2 years ago. He needed someone to help build this place, and I needed to leave St. Louis after my parents passed. There weren't many options for a woman alone. You don't owe me explanations, Wilhelmina, don't I? She asked, meeting his eyes directly. After what we've shared, the question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken feelings. Owen set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. What we've shared is a remarkable experience that I'll remember all my days, he said carefully. But you're a married woman, and I'm just a drifter who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Nothing more can come of it. The words hurt more than they should have, even though Wilhelmina knew them to be true. Of course, she said, looking away. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Owen stood, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I should check on the mare. She seemed off her feed this morning. He was nearly to the door when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. For a moment, they stared at each other, a world of unsaid things passing between them. Then Owen's expression shuddered, and he stepped outside to meet the rider. Wilhelmina heard the murmur of male voices, and her heart sank as she recognized her husband's deeper tones. She adjusted her clothing and sat up straighter, cradling Thomas close as the door opened. Edward Zanetti entered first, a stocky man of 40 with a weathered face and kind eyes, his clothes dust-covered from hard riding. Behind him stood Owen, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Willie, Edward breathed, rushing to her side. I came as soon as Jenkins found us. Are you well? The baby, he stopped, seeing Thomas for the first time. My son? Yes, Wilhelmina confirmed, smiling despite the turmoil in her heart. Thomas Robert Zanetti, born 3 nights ago during the storm. Edward gently touched the baby's head, wonder spreading across his face. He's perfect. He looked up at Owen, who had moved to stand by the door. Mr. McClintock told me what happened, that he delivered our boy when no one else could come. I owe you a debt I can never repay, sir. Owen shifted uncomfortably. As I told Mrs. Zanetti, I only did what any man would do. Few men would have known how, Edward countered, or stayed to ensure their welfare afterward. You're welcome at our table any time, McClintock. Now, will you join us for a meal before you continue to your brother's ranch? Wilhelmina held her breath, watching Owen's face. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she saw in his gaze all the things that might have been in another life. Thank you, but I've delayed my journey too long already, Owen replied, his voice steady. My mother's health won't wait. I should be on my way. Edward nodded, understanding. At least let me pay you for your trouble. No, Owen said firmly. I want nothing. His eyes flicked briefly to Wilhelmina and Thomas before returning to Edward. Seeing them both healthy is payment enough. The men shook hands, and then Owen was gone, slipping out of the cabin and into the bright Texas sunlight, the sound of his horse's hoofbeats fading like the last notes of a song Wilhelmina had only just begun to learn. Life resumed its expected course. Edward was a doting father and attentive husband, proudly showing off Thomas to neighbors and friends who came to visit once word spread of the baby's dramatic arrival. The story of the mysterious cowboy who delivered the Zanetti baby during the storm became something of a local legend, growing more embellished with each telling. For Wilhelmina, the adjustment back to her normal life was both easier and harder than expected. She loved Thomas fiercely and found genuine joy in motherhood. Her home was comfortable, her husband kind. Yet sometimes, especially in the quiet evenings when Edward dozed by the fire, she found herself staring out the window toward the north, wondering about Owen McClintock, if he'd reached his brother's ranch, if his mother's health had improved, if he ever thought about the night that had connected them so profoundly. Summer gave way to autumn, bringing cooler temperatures and the golden light that made the Texas landscape glow like burnished copper. Thomas grew stronger each day, his eyes so like his mother's, watching the world with increasing curiosity. Wilhelmina regained her strength and resumed her duties around the homestead, though Edward insisted on hiring a local girl to help with the heavier work. It was during this time, as life settled into its new rhythm, that news came of Jeremiah McClintock's death. The details arrived piecemeal through the gossip network that served as the frontier's primary source of information: a hunting accident, they said, or perhaps a fall from a horse. What was certain was that the Double M Ranch, one of the largest in the county, had lost its master. A shame about McClintock, Edward commented one evening as they sat at dinner. Never knew him well, but he seemed a fair man in business. Wonder what will become of the place now. Wilhelmina kept her expression neutral as she sliced Thomas's food into smaller pieces. Didn't he have family? A brother, perhaps. Heard he had a younger brother who showed up not long before he died. Owen or Orville, something like that. Bit of a drifter from what people say. Edward sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Question is whether he'll stay to run the place or sell it off. Not everyone's cut out for putting down roots. The words struck Wilhelmina with unexpected force. Owen had described himself as not much good at staying in one place. Would he leave again now that his brother was gone? The thought troubled her more than it should have. Perhaps, she said carefully, circumstances change a person's mind about what they're cut out for. Edward gave her a curious look but didn't pursue the subject, turning instead to his plans for expanding their vegetable garden come spring. Wilhelmina listened and nodded in all the right places, but her thoughts remained with the McClintock ranch and its uncertain future. 2 weeks later, a formal announcement appeared in the Presidio weekly newspaper. Owen McClintock had indeed inherited the Double M and intended to maintain its operations. The brief notice mentioned his plans to honor existing contracts and possibly expand the breeding program his brother had begun with Hereford cattle. Wilhelmina read the notice 3 times, relief washing over her for reasons she couldn't quite articulate even to herself. She folded the newspaper carefully and returned to kneading bread dough with renewed vigor, humming a tune she hadn't sung in months. The winter of 1876 proved unusually harsh for the Presidio region. Snow fell in early December and remained on the ground for weeks, a rare occurrence that delighted children but complicated life for ranchers and farmers. The Zanetti homestead weathered the cold well enough, their preparations adequate for the unexpected severity. Thomas, now 8 months old and attempting to crawl, kept Wilhelmina busy from dawn until dusk. Edward spent long hours ensuring their livestock had adequate feed and shelter, often returning to the cabin with frost in his beard and exhaustion in his eyes. The physical toll of ranching had always been evident, but this winter seemed to age him visibly, his movements slower, his breathing more labored after exertion. "You should rest more," Wilhelmina urged one evening as he massaged his aching shoulder by the fire. "Perhaps we could hire one of the Marquez boys to help with the heavy work until spring comes." Edward shook his head stubbornly. "We're making ends meet, but just barely. Can't afford hired help right now, not with the extra feed costs this winter." He smiled at her worried expression. "Don't fret, Willie. I've weathered worse seasons than this one." But his reassurances rang hollow when, 3 days later, he collapsed while clearing snow from the barn roof. Wilhelmina found him lying in the trampled snow, conscious but unable to stand, his left arm and side strangely limp. "Just need to catch my breath," he insisted as she helped him inside, his words slurring slightly. "Been pushing too hard." Wilhelmina recognized the signs from her father's similar episode years before: the drooping face, the weakness on one side, the confused speech. A stroke, the doctor insisted. Louis had called it. She settled Edward in bed, tucked Thomas into his cradle, and prepared to ride for help. "Don't leave," Edward protested weakly as she bundled into her warmest clothes. "Storm's coming, too dangerous." "We need the doctor," she replied firmly, kissing his forehead. "I'll be back before you know it." The ride to town was brutal. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted as the promised storm arrived with vengeful fury. Wilhelmina pushed her mare harder than was wise, knowing that Edward's life might depend on the speed of her journey. By the time she reached Dr. Pearson's house on the edge of Presidio, both she and the horse were near collapse from cold and exhaustion. "Mrs. Zanetti, doctor," Pearson exclaimed, pulling her inside. "What in heaven's name brings you out in this weather?" Through chattering teeth, Wilhelmina explained Edward's condition. The doctor's face grew grave as he listened. "A cerebral episode from the sound of it," he confirmed. "But Mrs. Zanetti, I cannot possibly reach your homestead tonight. This storm is turning into a full blizzard. We'd never make it." He needs help, Wilhelmina insisted. I can guide you. Even if we could travel, I'm needed here, Mrs. Rodriguez is in labor with twins, and old Mr. Franklin broke his hip this morning. He gripped her shoulders gently. Listen to me. Go to the general store. Mr. Walton is still open. Get these supplies. He scribbled a list quickly. Follow these instructions exactly. Keep your husband warm. Get these medicines into him however you can, and watch for the signs I'm describing. If the weather breaks tomorrow, I'll come immediately. Numb with fear and cold, Wilhelmina followed his instructions, purchasing the medications and supplies before forcing her exhausted mare back into the storm. The return journey seemed twice as long, the landscape transformed into an alien white wilderness that offered no landmarks to guide her. Several times she feared they had strayed from the path entirely, and only the mare's instinctual homing sense kept them moving in the right direction. When the cabin finally appeared through the swirling snow, Wilhelmina nearly wept with relief. But her heart sank as she approached and saw no smoke rising from the chimney. The fire had gone out during her absence. She dismounted painfully, her limbs stiff with cold, and staggered to the door. Inside, the temperature was barely warmer than outdoors. Thomas was crying in his cradle, his blankets pulled tightly around him. Edward lay motionless in the bed, his breathing shallow, his skin alarmingly cool to the touch. Moving with desperate urgency, Wilhelmina rekindled the fire, added every available blanket to Thomas's cradle, and set water to heat for Edward's medicine. Only when these essential tasks were underway did she allow herself a moment to acknowledge the gravity of their situation. Her husband was seriously ill, possibly dying. Her baby was hungry and cold. The storm outside had cut them off from all help, and their supplies would not last indefinitely if the weather continued. For the first time since that night during the storm when Thomas was born, Wilhelmina felt truly afraid. The next morning brought no relief from the blizzard. If anything, the wind had intensified, howling around the cabin like a living creature seeking entry. Edward had developed a fever during the night, and though Wilhelmina faithfully administered the medicines Dr. Pearson had prescribed, his condition continued to deteriorate. Thomas, sensing the tension in the cabin, was fretful and difficult to console. Wilhelmina divided her attention between her husband and son, snatching brief moments of sleep when both were temporarily settled. By noon, she realized with dismay that their firewood supply was dangerously low. The woodpile outside was buried under several feet of snow, and she lacked the strength to dig it out alone. As the day wore on, Wilhelmina began burning furniture, first the small side table, then one of the kitchen chairs. She knew that without heat, their chances of survival would diminish rapidly. Edward drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing her, sometimes calling for his first wife or speaking to people who weren't present. Each time he grew agitated, Wilhelmina soothed him as best she could, her own fear masked behind a calm facade. When the knock came at the door near dusk, she thought at first she had imagined it a trick of the wind or her own exhausted mind. But it came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a muffled voice calling her name. Cautiously, Wilhelmina approached the door, a kitchen knife gripped in her trembling hand. "Who's there?" she called. "Owen McClintock," came the reply, barely audible over the storm. "Are you all right in there, Wilhelmina?" For a moment, she couldn't move, convinced she was hallucinating. Then survival instinct took over and she fumbled with the latch, throwing the door open. Owen stood on her threshold, nearly unrecognizable beneath layers of winter clothing encrusted with snow and ice. Behind him, partially sheltered by the cabin wall, stood a heavily laden horse. "Owen," she breathed, the knife slipping from her fingers. "How?" "Heard in town you'd ridden in for the doctor yesterday," he explained, stepping inside and quickly closing the door against the bitter cold. "When the storm worsened, I got worried. No one should be alone in weather like this." His eyes took in the scene, the dismantled furniture, Edward's still form on the bed, Thomas fussing in his cradle, Wilhelmina herself pale with exhaustion. "Edward's had a stroke," she explained, her voice cracking. The doctor couldn't come. I've been trying to keep him stable, but the fever. She gestured helplessly. Without a word, Owen shed his outer layers and moved to Edward's bedside, examining him with the same calm efficiency he'd shown during Thomas's birth. Fever's dangerous, he confirmed. Seen this before with ranch hands. We need to cool him down, get more fluids in him. He turned to Wilhelmina. I've brought supplies, food, medicine, dry firewood. Let me help. The simple offer broke something in Wilhelmina, the dam of composure she'd maintained for nearly 2 days. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, suddenly too exhausted to speak. Owen's presence transformed their desperate situation. He brought in firewood and supplies, stoked the fire to a roaring blaze, and prepared hot food while Wilhelmina tended to Thomas. Together, they worked to reduce Edward's fever using cool compresses and the additional medications Owen had brought from his ranch. By midnight, Edward's breathing had eased somewhat, and the cabin was warm and secure against the continuing storm. You should sleep, Owen told Wilhelmina after they'd done all they could for Edward. I'll keep watch. Why did you come? She asked, the question that had burned in her mind since he appeared at her door. It's dangerous out there, you risked your life. Owen looked at her steadily, his expression softened by the firelight. You know why, Wilhelmina? The simple answer contained multitudes. In another time, another place, she might have pressed him further, might have asked him to speak aloud what both of them felt. But here, in this cabin, with her husband fighting for his life mere feet away, all she could do was nod and whisper, "Thank you." She slept deeply for the first time in days, waking to find Owen cradling Thomas by the fire, speaking to him in low, gentle tones about horses and cattle and the changing seasons. The sight pierced her heart with its rightness and its impossibility. The storm finally broke the following afternoon. Edward's condition had stabilized, though he remained weak and confused. Dr. Pearson arrived as soon as the roads became passable, accompanied by Edward's sister Martha, who had been visiting Presidio when the blizzard struck. You've done remarkably well, Doctor. Pearson told Wilhelmina after examining Edward. Between your quick action and Mr. McClintock's assistance, you've given him his best chance at recovery. Martha, a practical woman in her 50s who had never married, took control of the household with brisk efficiency. I'll stay and help care for Edward and the baby, she announced. You look ready to collapse, Wilhelmina. You need rest yourself. With Edward's care in capable hands and the immediate crisis past, Owen prepared to return to his own ranch. My foreman will be wondering if I've frozen to death in a snowdrift, he said, attempting lightness as he gathered his things. Wilhelmina walked with him to the barn where his horse waited, the cold air a shock after the warmth of the cabin. Around them, the world glittered beneath its blanket of snow, pristine and silent in the aftermath of the storm. I don't know how to thank you, she said as Owen saddled his horse. Again, it seems I'm destined to be in your debt. There is no debt between us, he replied, his back to her as he tightened the saddle girth. I came because I wanted to, because I needed to know you were safe. And now you'll go back to the Double M and I'll stay here with Edward. Wilhelmina spoke the truth they both understood but had never articulated. Owen turned to face her, his expression a complex mixture of resignation and determination. Yes, that's how it must be. Edward needs you now more than ever, and Thomas needs his father. And what about what I need? The question escaped before Wilhelmina could stop it, surprising them both. Owen stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the winter chill. What do you need, Wilhelmina? He asked softly. She shook her head, unable to answer. To speak the truth would be to betray Edward, to deny the vows she had made, to destroy the life she had built. It doesn't matter, she whispered. Some needs must go unmet. For a moment, she thought he might touch her, might take her hand or brush her cheek. Instead, he nodded once, accepting her answer with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. If you ever need me for anything at all, send word to the Double M, he said. I'll come, no matter what. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary figure against the vast white landscape, leaving Wilhelmina standing in the doorway of the barn with unshed tears freezing on her lashes. The months following the blizzard brought slow but significant changes to the Zanetti household. Edward's recovery progressed in fits, and starts some days finding him stronger, able to sit up and interact with Thomas. Other days seeing him confined to bed with debilitating headaches and weakness. His left side remained partially paralyzed, and his speech, though improved, still faltered when he was tired or agitated. Martha stayed on, her presence a godsend as she took over much of the household management and helped with Thomas, who celebrated his first birthday in the spring. The arrangement gave Wilhelmina more freedom to tend to the outdoor chores that Edward could no longer manage and to make necessary trips into town. It was during one such trip in early May that she encountered Owen McClintock for the first time since the blizzard. She had just emerged from the general store, her purchases balanced precariously in her arms, when his voice came from behind her. "Let me help you with those, Mrs. Zanetti." Wilhelmina turned, her heart performing a treacherous leap in her chest. Owen stood there, looking much as he had the first night she met him, though his clothing was of finer quality now, befitting his status as owner of the Double M. "Mr. McClintock," she acknowledged, striving for a neutral tone as she allowed him to take some of her packages. "Thank you." They walked together toward her wagon, maintaining a careful distance that did nothing to diminish the awareness crackling between them. "How is Edward?" Owen asked, his voice low enough that passers-by wouldn't overhear. "Improving, though more slowly than he'd like," Wilhelmina replied. "The doctor says he's fortunate many don't survive such episodes or recover as much function as he has." Owen nodded. "And you, how are you faring?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern rather than mere politeness, threatened to undo her composure. How was she faring? Exhausted from dividing her attention between a disabled husband, an active toddler, and a homestead that required constant work. Lonely despite Martha's company. Guilty for the thoughts that came unbidden in the quiet hours of the night, thoughts of what might have been had she met Owen before Edward, or had Edward not survived his stroke. "I manage," she said finally, the understatement of the year. They reached her wagon, and Owen loaded her purchases with efficient care. When he finished, he turned to her, his expression earnest. "I've been meaning to speak with you about something," he said, "a proposal of sorts." Wilhelmina's breath caught, 1,000 impossible scenarios flashing through her mind before reason reasserted itself. "The Double M needs help," Owen continued. "I've taken on more than I expected with Jeremiah's breeding program and with spring calving underway." He hesitated, then pressed on. "I understand Edward was planning to expand your cattle operation before his illness. I'd like to offer a partnership. My land and resources, your herd. I'd provide labor and expertise, you'd share in the profits." It was a business proposition, nothing more, yet Wilhelmina recognized it for what it was. Owen's way of helping without wounding Edward's pride or compromising her reputation. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure Edward would accept. Will you at least present it to him?" As one rancher to another, the arrangement would benefit us both. Owen's eyes held hers, conveying what his words could not. "This is the only way I can help you. Please let me help you." Wilhelmina nodded slowly. "I'll discuss it with him. That's all I can promise. That's all I ask." Owen touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Good day, Mrs. Zanetti." She watched him walk away, his tall figure attracting glances from several women on the street. Only when he disappeared into the bank did she release the breath she'd been holding and climb into her wagon for the journey home. Edward reacted to Owen's proposal better than Wilhelmina had anticipated. Perhaps his illness had tempered his pride, or perhaps he simply recognized the practical advantages of the arrangement. After several days of consideration and detailed questions that Wilhelmina relayed back and forth between the two men, he agreed to a trial partnership. The agreement transformed the Zanetti homestead. Owen sent ranch hands to help with the spring planting and repair work that had been neglected during Edward's illness. The Zanetti cattle were moved to better grazing land on the Double M, with Edward retaining full ownership but benefiting from the ranch's superior facilities and experienced cowboys. When summer arrived, the partnership expanded to include shared equipment and resources for the hay harvest. Throughout these changes, Owen maintained a respectful distance from Wilhelmina, visiting the homestead only when necessary and always ensuring Martha or one of his ranch hands was present. Their conversations remained strictly business, though sometimes their eyes would meet across the yard or table, and in those brief moments all pretense fell away. Edward, for his part, seemed unaware of the undercurrents between his wife and his business partner. His focus remained on his recovery and on Thomas, who had become the center of his world. By autumn, he had regained enough strength to move around the cabin with a cane and to sit outdoors on fine days, watching the activities on the homestead with keen interest if not active participation. It was during one such afternoon in late September that Edward raised a subject Wilhelmina had not anticipated. "Owen McClintock is a good man," he said abruptly as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas toddle after a butterfly in the yard. "Better than most." Wilhelmina's hands stilled in her lap. "Yes, he's been very helpful with the partnership." Edward turned to look at her, his gaze clearer and more penetrating than it had been in months. "It's more than that, Willie. He could have taken advantage of our situation, offered pennies on the dollar for our stock, waited for us to fail, then swooped in to buy the land. Many would have." "I don't think Owen is capable of that kind of calculation," Wilhelmina replied carefully. "No, he isn't." Edward was quiet for a moment, watching their son. "Do you know what I think about sometimes, sitting here day after day?" "What's that?" "The future, Thomas's future, yours," he sighed, a weary sound that seemed to come from deep within. "I'm not getting better, Willie, not really." "Edward, don't," he held up a hand to stop her protest. "I'm not being maudlin, just practical. Dr. Pearson says I could have another episode anytime. Might be years from now, might be tomorrow. Each one leaves a man weaker than before." Wilhelmina felt tears prickling behind her eyes. For all their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, she had grown to care deeply for Edward, to respect his strength and determination, to appreciate his kindness. "We'll manage," she assured him. "One day at a time, like we have been." Edward shook his head, a rueful smile touching his lips. "Always so brave, my Willie, but I need you to listen now. If something happens to me, when something happens to me, I don't want you struggling alone out here. This land is harsh on a woman without a partner." "I have Martha," Wilhelmina pointed out, though they both knew his sister wouldn't stay forever. She had her own life in Austin, had only extended her visit out of family duty. "Martha will help for a time," Edward agreed, "but Thomas needs a father, and you." He reached over with his good hand to take hers. "You deserve a man who can stand beside you, not one you have to carry." Wilhelmina squeezed his hand, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Edward Zanetti, I won't have you talking this way. You're my husband, Thomas's father." "Nothing will change that. Everything changes, Willie. That's the nature of life out here." His eyes drifted to the distant horizon where the double Mtkes land began. "I've seen how he looks at you, and how you look at him when you think no one notices." Wilhelmina felt the blood drain from her face. "Edward, I know you haven't," he interrupted gently. "You're too honorable for that, both of you are. It's one of the reasons I trust him. One of the reasons I could accept him as the man who might stand in my place someday." "Please don't talk like this," Wilhelmina begged, her voice breaking. "I can't bear it." Edward turned back to her, his expression softened by compassion. "I'm sorry to distress you, but I needed you to know that I understand. And that when the time comes, you have my blessing to find happiness again, with whoever might bring you that happiness." The conversation haunted Wilhelmina for days afterward. Edward didn't raise the subject again, seeming content to have said his piece, but his words had opened a door she had kept firmly closed in her own mind. The possibility of a future different from her present, a future that might include Owen in a way she had forbidden herself to imagine, now existed, acknowledged by the very person whose existence had made it impossible. The knowledge was both liberating and excruciating. It changed nothing in her daily life, yet it changed everything in her heart. Autumn deepened toward winter, the partnership between the Zanetti homestead and the Double M continuing to flourish. Edward's health remained stable, neither improving dramatically nor worsening. Thomas grew more communicative, his vocabulary expanding daily, his personality emerging as a delightful blend of his mother's thoughtfulness and his father's determination. In November, a telegram arrived from Austin. Martha's daughter had given birth to twins and needed her mother's help. With apologies but obvious joy at becoming a grandmother, Martha packed her things and departed on the next stage coach, leaving Wilhelmina to manage the household alone once more. The timing proved unfortunate. A week after Martha's departure, an early cold snap descended on the region, bringing frigid temperatures that froze the water troughs and made outdoor work miserable. Wilhelmina struggled to keep up with the increased demands, carrying extra firewood, breaking ice for the livestock, maintaining heat in the cabin for Edward's comfort. On the third day of the cold spell, Owen arrived unannounced, leading a wagon containing a young Mexican woman and her teenage brother. "Forgive the intrusion," he said when Wilhelmina met him in the yard, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "This is Rosalinda Vega and her brother Miguel. Their family has worked for the Double M for 3 generations. Rosalinda is an excellent cook and housekeeper, and Miguel is strong and willing to learn, I thought perhaps with Martha gone." Wilhelmina stared at him, understanding dawning. Once again, Owen had anticipated her needs before she could even articulate them to herself. "It's temporary, of course," he added hastily. "Just until the worst of the winter passes or Martha returns. They'll stay in the old bunkhouse if that suits. The Double M will cover their wages." It was a perfectly reasonable arrangement that maintained all proprieties while providing Wilhelmina with desperately needed help. Still, she hesitated, aware that accepting would deepen her connection to Owen and the Double M, would blur the already indistinct line between business partnership and personal relationship. "Please, Senora," Rosalinda spoke up, her English accented but clear. "We would be honored to help." "Senor McClintock speaks highly of your family." The sincerity in the young woman's voice decided the matter. Wilhelmina smiled and extended her hand in welcome. "We would be grateful for your help, Rosalinda, and yours, Miguel. Please come inside and get warm." Owen remained outside as the Vegas carried their few possessions to the bunkhouse, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the homestead. "You've been working too hard," he observed when Wilhelmina returned to the yard. "Your hands are raw from the cold." She tucked them into her pockets, self-conscious under his scrutiny. "There's always work to be done." "Yes, but not all of it by you," he gestured toward the bunkhouse. "Let them help, Wilhelmina, that's why they're here." "And why are you here, Owen?" she asked, the question emerging more directly than she'd intended. Truly, his eyes met hers, steady and unflinching in the winter sunlight. "You know why." The same answer he'd given during the blizzard, its simplicity containing all the complexity of their situation. Wilhelmina nodded, accepting both what he said and what remained unspoken. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the help and for—" She trailed off, unable to find words for the rest. Owen inclined his head in acknowledgement, then turned back to his horse. "I'll check in regularly to see that all is well. Send Miguel to the Double M if you need anything at all." As he rode away, Wilhelmina felt Edward watching from the cabin window. When she returned inside, he said nothing about Owen's visit or the new arrangements, but his eyes held a knowing sadness that spoke volumes. The Vegas proved to be a blessing beyond measure. Rosalinda transformed the cabin with her cooking and housekeeping skills, while Miguel tackled the outdoor chores with youthful enthusiasm, freeing Wilhelmina to spend more time with Thomas and Edward. The bitterly cold weather continued, but life inside the Zanetti home grew warmer and more comfortable by the day. December arrived, bringing with it preparations for Christmas. Rosalinda introduced Mexican traditions to their celebration, teaching Wilhelmina to make tamales and decorating the cabin with paper flowers. Miguel cut a small pine tree from the foothills and set it up in the corner of the main room, to Thomas's wide-eyed delight. True to his word, Owen visited regularly to check on his employees and the Zanetti family. His visits were brief and proper, often consisting of little more than a conversation with Edward about cattle prices or with Miguel about tasks around the homestead. Yet Wilhelmina felt his presence like a physical thing, her awareness of him a constant undercurrent beneath the surface of her daily life. On Christmas Eve, Owen arrived with gifts: a rocking horse for Thomas, crafted by the double Mtikes carpenter, a fine wool shawl for Wilhelmina that he claimed came from a merchant in Presidio, but that she suspected had been ordered from San Antonio or even further afield, and for Edward, an elaborately tooled leather portfolio containing detailed breeding records of both the Double M and Zanetti herds, with projections for future expansion. "This is too generous," Edward protested, running his good hand over the portfolio's intricate design. Owen shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. "Consider it a business investment. Those calculations took my foreman and me weeks to complete. I expect you to study them and give me your thoughts after the holidays." The gesture touched Wilhelmina deeply. Owen had given Edward not just a gift, but a purpose, treating him as a valued partner rather than an invalid to be pitied. From the emotion in Edward's eyes as he opened the portfolio and began examining its contents, she knew her husband recognized and appreciated the sentiment behind the present. After dinner, as Miguel helped Edward to bed and Rosalinda cleaned the kitchen, Wilhelmina found herself alone with Owen on the porch. The night was clear and cold, stars blazing overhead in the vast Texas sky. They stood side by side, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth in the December chill. "Thank you for the shawl," Wilhelmina said after a comfortable silence. "It's beautiful, far too fine for a rancher's wife." "Nothing is too fine for you," Owen replied, his voice low. Then, as if realizing he'd stepped too close to a line they'd carefully maintained, he added, "You deserve beauty in your life, Wilhelmina. All of you do." She turned to study his profile in the moonlight, struck by how familiar his features had become to her: the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkle at the corner of his eye, the way his mouth curved when he was holding back emotion. "You've brought more than beauty into our lives," she said softly. "You've brought hope, security, friendship." The last word seemed inadequate, almost dishonest, but it was all she could safely offer. Owen's gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon. "Is that enough, friendship?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous in its simplicity. Wilhelmina thought of Edward's blessing, freely given but impossible to accept while he lived. She thought of Thomas, thriving under the love and attention of 3 adults who adored him. She thought of the life she had built and the vows she had made, of honor and duty and the complexities of love in its many forms. "It has to be," she answered finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now." Owen turned to her then, his eyes reflecting the starlight. For a breathless moment, she thought he might touch her, might take her hand or brush a strand of hair from her face. Instead, he nodded once, accepting her answer as he had accepted so much else about their impossible situation. "Merry Christmas, Wilhelmina," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Then he stepped back, creating distance between them, and added with deliberate lightness, "I should be going. Early start tomorrow, even on Christmas." She watched him walk to his horse, his figure outlined against the starlit landscape. Just before mounting, he turned back to her, raising a hand in farewell. Wilhelmina raised her own in response, the gesture containing all the feelings neither of them could speak aloud. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. The partnership between the Zanetti homestead and the Double M continued to thrive, bringing prosperity to both. Edward's health remained stable, though he tired easily and required regular rest. Thomas celebrated his 2nd birthday surrounded by friends and neighbors, his infectious laughter and boundless energy the center of attention. The Vegas had become an integral part of the household. Rosalinda's gentle presence soothed the entire family, while Miguel, now 17, had developed into a capable ranch hand under Owen's guidance. They lived in the bunkhouse year-round, providing the help Wilhelmina needed while maintaining a respectful distance that preserved the family's privacy. Throughout this time, Owen remained a constant presence in their lives, close enough to offer support when needed, distant enough to avoid gossip or impropriety. He and Edward had developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared interests, spending hours discussing breeding strategies and ranch management. With Thomas, Owen was patient and engaging, teaching the boy about horses and cattle with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. And with Wilhelmina, he maintained the careful balance they had established, that Christmas night friendship layered with unspoken understanding, proximity without intimacy, connection without crossing boundaries. It was both more and less than either of them wanted, but it was all they could honorably have. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely had fate not intervened. In late August, as the summer heat reached its peak, Edward suffered a second stroke more severe than the first. Dr. Pearson was summoned immediately, but his prognosis was grim. "His body has been through too much," he told Wilhelmina privately after examining Edward. "I don't expect him to regain consciousness." For 3 days, Wilhelmina barely left Edward's bedside, speaking to him softly, holding his hand, monitoring each labored breath. Thomas, sensing the gravity of the situation despite his young age, became unusually quiet, clinging to Rosalinda and watching his mother with solemn eyes. Owen arrived within hours of receiving word about Edward's condition. He took charge of the homestead operations, ensuring the animals were tended and necessary work completed while the household focused on Edward's care. In the evenings, he sat with Wilhelmina in the sickroom, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing memories of Edward's determination and quiet strength. On the 4th night, as a cooling breeze finally broke the oppressive heat, Edward Zanetti drew his last breath. His passing was peaceful, his hand held firmly in Wilhelmina's as she whispered her gratitude for their life together and her promise to raise Thomas with the values Edward cherished. The funeral was held 2 days later in the small cemetery outside Presidio. Half the county attended, a testament to Edward's standing in the community. Wilhelmina stood dry-eyed beside the grave, Thomas's small hand clutched in hers, receiving condolences with quiet dignity. Owen remained in the background, a solid presence she was aware of even when not looking directly at him. The days following the funeral passed in a blur of practical arrangements and emotional numbness. Wilhelmina moved through her duties mechanically, caring for Thomas, managing the household, responding appropriately to the meals and sympathy calls that arrived from neighbors. Only at night, alone in her bed, did she allow herself to weep, not just for Edward, but for all the complicated feelings his death had unleashed: grief for a good man gone too soon, relief that his suffering had ended, guilt over that relief, concern for Thomas, now fatherless, uncertainty about the future. And beneath it all, a confused tangle of emotions regarding Owen: gratitude for his unwavering support, anxiety about what might change between them, and yes, a carefully guarded hope that something new might eventually grow from the seeds of feeling they had both suppressed for so long. 2 weeks after the funeral, Owen arrived at the homestead earlier than usual, dressed in his best clothes rather than his working attire. Wilhelmina received him in the parlor, her black morning dress a stark contrast to the warm autumn sunlight streaming through the windows. "I've come to discuss business," Owen said after the initial greetings, his manner more formal than it had been in months. "About the partnership." "Of course," Wilhelmina replied, her hands folded in her lap to hide their slight trembling. She had wondered when this conversation would come, had prepared herself for various possibilities that Owen might offer to buy her out, might suggest a new arrangement, might even propose dissolving the partnership entirely. What she wasn't prepared for was his actual proposal. "I'd like to merge our operations completely," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his nervousness. "Not just a partnership, a full joining of the Double M and the Zanetti homestead. Wilhelmina stared at him, trying to understand the implications. You want to buy my land? No. Owen leaned forward, his expression earnest. I want to join our lands, our herds, our lives. He took a deep breath. Wilhelmina, I'm asking you to marry me. The words hung in the air between them, at once shocking and somehow inevitable. Wilhelmina felt her heart racing, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Owen, Edward has only been gone 2 weeks. It's too soon to think of such things. I know, he acknowledged, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. Believe me, I know how this must appear, but hear me out, please, she nodded, unable to speak. I've respected your marriage. I've kept my distance. I've been content with friendship because it was all that honor would allow. Owen's voice grew more passionate as he continued. But I've loved you since the night Thomas was born. I've loved you through all of it, through the blizzard, through Edward's illness, through every moment we've shared and all the ones we couldn't. Tears filled Wilhelmina's eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. This was the conversation they had never allowed themselves to have, the feelings they had never permitted themselves to acknowledge openly. I loved Edward, she said, needing to speak that truth before anything else. I know you did, and he knew it too. Owen's expression softened. He also knew how you felt about me. He told me, Wilhelmina, before he died. She looked up sharply. He spoke to you about me? Owen nodded. The week before his stroke, he asked me to look after you and Thomas, said he'd already told you he wanted you to find happiness again when he was gone. He did, Wilhelmina whispered, remembering that conversation on the porch nearly a year ago. I'm not asking for an immediate answer, Owen continued. I know you need time to grieve. I know there are proprieties to be observed. All I'm asking is that you consider it. Consider us. Not just for practical reasons, though God knows there are many, but because what we feel for each other deserves its chance. Wilhelmina was silent for a long moment, her thoughts in turmoil. The depth of her feelings for Owen was undeniable. So was the practical sense of joining their operations. Thomas adored him, and Owen had proven his devotion to them both 100 times over. Yet marriage so soon after Edward's death seemed disrespectful to his memory, regardless of his blessing. I need time, she said finally, not just for appearance's sake, but for my own heart, for Thomas. For all of us. Owen nodded, relief evident in his expression. It wasn't a rejection, just a postponement. Take all the time you need. The partnership continues as before. I'll be here, Wilhelmina. I've waited this long. I can wait longer. As he rose to leave, Wilhelmina stood as well, suddenly unwilling to let him go without some acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Owen, she said softly, reaching for his hand. Thank you for waiting, for understanding, for everything. He took her hand, his much larger one engulfing hers with gentle strength. For the first time since they'd known each other, he raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was both respectful and imbued with promise. Always, he murmured, then released her and walked out into the autumn sunlight. The year that followed Edward's death brought many changes to the Zanetti homestead. Gradually, Wilhelmina emerged from the fog of grief, finding new purpose in expanding the cattle operation and providing stability for Thomas. The partnership with the Double M continued to thrive, bringing increased prosperity to both properties. Owen remained a constant presence, supportive but never pressuring, allowing Wilhelmina the space and time she needed to heal. As winter yielded to spring, Wilhelmina began to consider Owen's proposal in earnest. The practical advantages were obvious combined. Their operations would be one of the largest in the county. Thomas would have a father figure he already adored. The homestead would have the security of Owen's resources and expertise. But beyond these considerations, Wilhelmina found herself increasingly drawn to the possibility of happiness true, deep happiness of the kind Edward had wished for her. When Thomas turned 3 in April, Owen organized a special celebration at the Double M, a barbecue and small carnival with games and treats for all the local children. Watching him lift Thomas onto a gentle pony, his hands steady and sure on the boy's small body, Wilhelmina felt something settle in her heart. That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep exhausted from his exciting day, Wilhelmina and Owen sat on the porch of the main house at the Double M, the spring air soft around them. "Thank you for today," she said, looking out over the ranch that had become as familiar to her as her own homestead. "Thomas had a wonderful time. So did I," Owen replied, his expression relaxed in the gathering twilight. "He's a remarkable boy, Wilhelmina, so much like you in his determination, yet he has Edward's thoughtfulness too. He's becoming more attached to you every day," she observed. "This morning he asked if you could teach him to rope calves when he's bigger." Owen smiled, pleasure evident in his expression. "I'd be honored to teach him anything he wants to learn, anything at all." Wilhelmina took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what she needed to say. "And if he wanted to learn to call you father, would that be something you'd welcome?" Owen went very still, understanding the significance of her question. "More than anything in the world," he said quietly, but only if his mother was sure it was what she wanted too. "I've had a year to think about what I want," Wilhelmina said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "A year to grieve Edward, to consider your proposal, to imagine what our life together might be." "And what have you decided?" Owen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering directly, Wilhelmina reached out and took his hand the first time she had initiated such contact between them. "Do you remember what you said to me the night Thomas was born?" Owen's expression softened at the memory. "I said many things that night." "You told me I was brave," she reminded him. "But the truth is, I've never felt braver than I do right now, telling you that I'm ready. Ready to join our lands, our herds, our lives. Ready to be your wife if you still want that." For a moment, Owen seemed unable to speak, overwhelmed by her words. Then he lifted her hand to his lips, just as he had done a year ago, but this time, the gesture was followed by him drawing her gently into his arms. "I have wanted that every day since I first saw you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will want it every day for the rest of my life." When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to Wilhelmina's eyes, a kiss that honored all they had been through to reach this moment, all they had sacrificed, all they had waited for. It felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding a truth she had always known but never fully acknowledged until now. They were married in June, when the Texas landscape was lush with wildflowers and promise. The ceremony was held at the Double M, attended by friends and neighbors from across the county. Thomas, resplendent in a new suit, proudly carried the rings. Rosalinda and Miguel, who had chosen to stay with the family, decorated the ranch house with flowers and ribbons. Even Martha returned from Austin for the occasion, her approval evident in the warm embrace she gave both bride and groom. After the ceremony, as guests enjoyed the wedding feast, Owen led Wilhelmina away from the celebration to a hilltop overlooking both properties, the Double M's vast grasslands merging seamlessly with the smaller but equally verdant Zanetti homestead. "Our land," he said, his arm around her waist. "Our future?" Wilhelmina leaned against him, contentment filling her heart. "When you came to my door that night during the storm, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Didn't you?" Owen asked, a smile in his voice. "I think part of me knew even then. Something about the way you looked at me, even in the midst of your pain and fear. Something about how right it felt to help bring Thomas into the world. You told me I was brave," Wilhelmina recalled, turning in his arms to face him. "But you were the brave one, Owen. Loving me when you couldn't have me, waiting when waiting seemed endless, finding ways to help us while preserving Edward's dignity and my honor." Owen shook his head, his expression solemn. "No, my love. True courage was yours facing childbirth alone, supporting Edward through his illness, raising Thomas with such grace, and now taking a chance on building a new life with me." He looked past her to where Thomas was playing with the other children, his laughter carrying on the summer breeze. "I promise you this, Wilhelmina McClintock. I will spend every day making sure you never regret the choice you've made. I will be a father to Thomas and any other children we might have. I will honor Edward's memory and the life you built with him. And I will love you with everything I am for as long as I live." Wilhelmina reached up to touch his face, overcome by the depth of feeling between them. "We've waited so long for this," she whispered, "for us. And now we have the rest of our lives," Owen replied, drawing her close once more. "Every day, every season, every year together." As the sun began to set over their joined lands, painting the Texas sky in hues of gold and crimson, Wilhelmina and Owen sealed their vows with a kiss that contained all the promise of their future, a future built on sacrifice and patience, on honor and duty, but most of all, on a love that had withstood every test and emerged stronger for the waiting. 3 years later, Wilhelmina stood on the porch of their home at the Double M, watching Owen teaching Thomas to ride his first real horse, not a pony, but a gentle mare specially chosen for the boy's 6th birthday. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the movements of the child who would join their family in just a few weeks. Beside her, Rosalinda hung laundry on the line, humming a Mexican lullaby. Miguel, now a foreman at the ranch and engaged to the schoolteacher's daughter, led a string of horses toward the corral, waving as he passed. "Mama, look at me," Thomas called, his face alight with excitement as Owen guided the mare in a careful circle. "I'm riding like Papa." "I see you, sweetheart," Wilhelmina called back, her heart full to bursting with love for her son and the man who had become his father in every way that mattered. Thomas had started calling Owen Papa shortly after their marriage, the transition as natural as breathing. Owen had accepted the title with tears in his eyes, understanding the gift he had been given. Life at the newly named ZM Ranch had settled into a rhythm of work and joy, challenges and triumphs. The combined herds had indeed become one of the largest operations in the county. The original Zanetti homestead had been expanded into a proper ranch house, where they stayed when working that part of their land. Thomas attended the school in Presidio, riding in with Miguel or Owen each morning, returning home full of stories and new learning. And through it all, Wilhelmina and Owen's love had deepened and matured the passion that had simmered beneath the surface for so long, now freely expressed, yet tempered by the respect and friendship that had formed its foundation. They argued occasionally, compromised frequently, and every night thanked whatever fate had brought them together on that stormy night when Thomas entered the world. As Owen lifted Thomas down from the mare, the boy ran toward Wilhelmina, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you see me, Mama?" "I wasn't scared at all. You were very brave," she assured him, smoothing his hair. "Just like your papa taught you to be." Owen joined them on the porch, his hand automatically finding the small of Wilhelmina's back in a gesture of affection that had become habitual. "And just like his mama has always been," he added, his eyes meeting hers with a love that still took her breath away. "The bravest woman I've ever known." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Owen's hand resting protectively over their unborn child, Wilhelmina reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From strangers thrown together by circumstance to partners joined by choice, their story had been one of patience and perseverance, of doing what was right even when it meant denying what they wanted most. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Owen murmured, his voice soft in the darkness. "About how life brings us what we need, even when it's not what we expect," she replied, turning to face him. "About how sometimes the longest road leads to the most beautiful destination." Owen pulled her closer, his strength a comfort she had come to rely on. "I would have waited forever for you," he said simply. "Some things are worth any price." "And some people," Wilhelmina whispered, reaching up to touch his face in the moonlight, "are worth crossing any distance to find." When their daughter was born a month later, a strong, healthy girl they named Elizabeth, after Owen's mother, the family gathered around to welcome her into a home built on love that had been tested and proven, on patience that had been rewarded, and on courage that had never faltered. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, Wilhelmina thought of that stormy night when a stranger had appeared at her door and changed the course of her life with his steady hands and gentle words, she did so with gratitude rather than regret, for without that night, without the challenges that followed, she might never have discovered the depth of her own strength or the true meaning of the word brave.